Have you ever been called redundant after giving nearly 20 years of your life to a company? What would you do if the very people who ignored your warnings, dismissed your work, and treated you as invisible decided to cut you loose with a smile and call it a favor? Would you walk away quietly? Or would you remind them that the person they overlooked was the one holding the entire place together? This is my story. Please take a moment to listen, reflect, and tell me in the comments, what would you have done in my shoes? My name is Linda Carver. I am 39 years old, and I come from a small town outside of Dayton, Ohio. For nearly 20 years, I have worked in operations and compliance, most recently at Northwell Dynamics, a mid-sized logistics company that liked to call itself innovative, even though the paint was peeling in the hallways and the vending machine ate your dollars more often than it gave you a soda. My title sounded small, but my work was the thread that held the whole place together. If payroll broke, if contractor classifications were wrong, if state reports threatened to miss their deadline, it was me sitting at my desk at 7 hours in the morning with black coffee strong enough to burn and a headache already settling behind my eyes. I was the quiet engine under the hood, the one nobody saw, the one nobody thanked. But without me, everything would have buckled years ago. I never brought cupcakes for birthdays, never joined karaoke nights or weekend potlucks, and my desk was wedged between the janitor's closet and a humming vending machine that rattled like a bad conscience. I was not the employee they photographed for brochures. But when someone's benefits vanished, when tax forms went missing, when an overtime sheet looked suspicious, I was the one who solved it. My inbox was the place where problems came to die, and I killed them with precision. My only company was a stubborn little ivy plant named Margaret that clung to life as if she knew she was trapped in the same fluorescent cave I was. People passed me in the hallway with distracted smiles, never realizing I was the reason their paychecks cleared and their vacation hours showed up correctly. Resentment grows slowly when you live like that. It starts like a drip from a leaky faucet, small and ignorable. You tell yourself it is part of the job. You tell yourself you are lucky to have stability. But then years go by and the drip becomes a steady drumbeat. 18 years of cleaning up other people's mistakes, 18 years of carrying files heavier than promotions, 18 years of being told I was a lifesaver, but never worth more than an associate. I trained interns who did not know the difference between a W-2 and a 401k, and I smiled politely when they were praised for innovation while I was told I was reliable, like a stapler or a desk lamp. I wanted to scream, but instead I drank more coffee and filed more reports. Deep down, I knew one truth that nobody wanted to say out loud. If Northwell Dynamics had ever been audited, if anyone from the outside had dug into our records, the company would have crumbled under the weight of its own incompetence. The only reason it did not was because of me, because I made every messy corner look presentable. They thought I was invisible, but I was the only shield standing between them and disaster. And sometimes, when the resentment kept me awake at night, I wondered what would happen if I stepped back. If I let the engine stall, if I allowed the paperwork to tell the real story. It was a dangerous thought, but it never quite left me. That quiet, simmering thought was the seed of something they never saw coming. The invitation arrived on a gray Monday morning, subject line plain and soulless, quick touch point, HR plus ops. I stared at it for a long moment, my hand frozen above the keyboard, because those were the kinds of words that always carried the smell of endings. Nobody ever scheduled a quick touch point to congratulate you. Nobody ever called HR into a meeting unless they needed to dress up bad news with friendly smiles and corporate vocabulary. I walked down the hall with my coffee still steaming, past the same faded posters about teamwork and synergy, and stepped into conference room 3 where the air felt colder than the rest of the building. At the table sat Elaine Hart, 42, head of human resources, with her crimson lipstick drawn sharp like a warning sign. Next to her was Tyler Grant, 25, an HR intern who once asked me if compliance meant updating computer software. Elaine clasped her hands like she was about to deliver condolences at a funeral. "Linda," she said brightly, "thank you for coming. We appreciate all the years you have given Northwell Dynamics." I lowered myself into the chair opposite her, already hearing the sentence before she spoke it. "Unfortunately, your position has been deemed redundant as part of our strategic restructuring." The word redundant sat between us like spoiled food, and I repeated it slowly in my head as if it might mean something else if I turned it around. Elaine's voice grew cheerier, like sugar sprinkled on poison. "We believe this will be a positive pivot for you. You have incredible skills, and I am sure you will land on your feet. Of course, we want to support you with a modest severance package." She smiled like she had just handed me a prize. Tyler nodded beside her, eager, as if he had just witnessed a masterclass in corporate compassion. I did not move. I did not flinch. I just folded my hands neatly on the table. Inside that, though, something was snapping into focus, sharper than glass, colder than steel. Redundant. That was how they described 18 years of fixing their mistakes, 18 years of dragging them out of legal quicksand. I thought about the weekends I had spent combing through overtime reports, the nights I answered emails while my neighbors were at barbecues, the mornings I arrived before sunrise to make sure tax filings were correct. Redundant. I thought about the bonuses I never saw, the promotions that went to managers who barely understood the systems I built. Redundant. I thought about Margaret, my ivy plant on the desk next to the vending machine, surviving in shadows just like me. Redundant. The silence stretched, heavy, until I finally nodded once and said the single word they wanted to hear. Understood. The word tasted different in my mouth, like it had teeth. Elaine exhaled as if a storm had passed, sliding a thin manila envelope across the table. "Inside you will find your exit documents. Please review them carefully. Tyler will walk you through next steps." I took the envelope, stood up calmly, and left the room without another word. My face was still, professional, unreadable. But deep inside my chest, a storm was gathering. I had spent nearly 2 decades protecting them from themselves, and now they wanted to call it a favor by cutting me loose. They thought I would leave quietly. They had no idea that the woman they called redundant was about to remind them just how essential she had always been. I walked out of the building with the envelope tucked under my arm, the same way I once carried binders full of compliance audits. No dramatic exits, no tears, not even a cardboard box. Just me, my handbag, and the faint sound of the vending machine humming behind me as if it were already replacing me. That night, I sat at my kitchen table with Margaret the Ivy beside me, and I opened the envelope under the yellow glow of the dining room light. The papers smelled of toner and bureaucracy, neat paragraphs of legal phrasing designed to sound generous when they were anything but. I read every line slowly, not because I was sentimental, but because I had trained myself to see the traps other people overlooked. That was when I found it, buried in the middle of a paragraph like a rotten tooth hiding in a smile. Due to exempt status, no additional compensation for accrued overtime is required. That single line made my eyebrow twitch. For years, I had been the one reminding managers what exempt status did and did not cover, the one who caught the errors before they became liabilities. I had written entire training decks about overtime law. I knew the difference between exempt and non-exempt like I knew the back of my own hand. And now, here it was in black and white. A careless line that ignored the reality of hundreds of hours of unpaid overtime they had quietly depended on me to provide. They thought I would swallow it, sign my name, and walk away. They thought wrong. I did not sleep much that night. I was not devastated, and I was not broken. I have cried harder over discontinued coffee brands. No, this was something else entirely, something cold and focused. The same mental clarity I used when I reconciled payroll for 3 departments at once, or when I caught a missing signature seconds before a filing deadline. I woke at 6:30 sharp, brewed my coffee strong and bitter, dropped 3 ice cubes into Margaret's soil, and opened my laptop. I pulled up the email from Elaine with its polite tone and its list of next steps, and I reread it with the precision of a surgeon. Every word, every comma, every careless phrase was a map. And in the middle of it all, that line about exempt status glowed like a warning flare. I began typing. The words came easily, steady, and professional. Thank you for the clarification. That was it, plain and clean. But I added one more step, a little detail they would not expect. I CC'd the Ohio Division of Wage and Hour Compliance. No manifesto, no accusations, just a neutral question about policy phrasing. 4 words and 1 address. That was all it took to turn their neat little envelope into a live wire. I sat back, took a sip of my coffee, and whispered to Margaret, "Are you ready, girl?" Then I clicked send. The sound of that mouse click was small, but I knew it was the beginning of something very big. By the time the sun had fully risen, my little email had already made its first ripple. At 9:12 a.m., a red receipt confirmed that Elaine had opened it, and I imagined her sitting at her spotless desk with that same crimson lipstick, rereading my words over and over as if they might magically change. At 9:27 a.m., a new message appeared in my inbox by accident, a reply all that was never meant for my eyes. Why would she CC the state board? Can someone confirm if overtime recapture applies under exempt classification? Please advise. The words were short, panicked, rushed, and the best part was that someone had typed them in. Writing where they could never be erased. It was only mid-morning, and already the cracks were spreading. I did not reply. I did not need to. The beauty of procedure is that once you set it in motion, it gathers momentum all by itself. By 10:06 a.m., another chain surfaced, this one forwarded to half of the legal department. If the board follows up, we may be required to provide 7 years of documentation. 7 years. The words rang like a bell. 7 years of payroll logs, overtime records, contractor agreements, and classification audits that I had patched and corrected and flagged again and again. I pictured the filing cabinets groaning under the weight of all that negligence, waiting to be opened. Meanwhile, my phone buzzed with quiet messages from friends still inside the office. "What did you do?" one asked, the subject line marked only with 3 question marks. Another sent me a blurry photo of a whiteboard scrawled with red marker. Payroll Audit Prep. 2015. 2022. It looked less like planning and more like the setup to a crime drama. I sat back in my chair, warmed my hands around my mug, and let a smile flicker across my face. For nearly 2 decades, they had ignored my emails, brushed off my warnings, told me to stop overcomplicating things. Now they were scrambling, and I had not even broken a sweat. By noon, Elaine sent a company-wide email dripping with passive-aggressive polish. As a reminder, all employment-related communications should remain internal and confidential. External outreach may lead to misinterpretations of policy. Translation: Do not be like Linda. Do not shine a light in the places we have worked so hard to keep dark. But the damage was already done. Once you wobble the first domino, there is no stopping the fall. Every sentence she wrote only confirmed that they were rattled, and rattled people make mistakes. That afternoon, while the office descended into whispers and hurried meetings, I did something radical. I took a nap. I stretched out on my couch with Margaret perched happily on the windowsill, and I closed my eyes with the calm of someone who had carried the weight of an entire company for too long. For once, it was not my responsibility to fix the mess. For once, they were the ones running in circles, and I was the one resting. The storm was only beginning, and I intended to enjoy the silence before the thunder. The morning after Elaine's desperate company-wide reminder, the dominoes began to fall in plain view. At 8:42 a.m., one of my old teammates from operations, Carla Martinez, 37, sent me a message from her personal email. The subject line said nothing but the words, "Oh, you lit the fuse." Attached was a photo she had snapped in passing, the inside of conference room C, its whiteboard crammed with frantic notes. Across the top, someone had written in red capital letters, "Urgent payroll audit prep. Start date 2015. Beneath that were bullet points about contractor agreements, overtime logs, and missing I-9 files. It looked less like planning and more like evidence being cataloged. I stared at the photo for a long moment, then sipped my coffee with the calm of someone watching a storm gather over someone else's roof. By mid-morning, rumors were already leaking through the cracks. Mark Jensen, 45, the finance director who once dismissed my compliance presentations as paranoid paperwork, was reportedly pale and sweating during a budget meeting. He had asked in a shaky voice whether the labor board could demand retroactive pay for exempt staff. Someone told me he gripped his pen so tightly it snapped in two. Meanwhile, the younger staff were buzzing in Slack threads, their usual emojis and memes replaced with clipped phrases like policy review and urgent document dump. It was the silence between the lines that said everything. People who had laughed at me for being too precise were now terrified that my precision had caught up with them. Around noon, another mass email rolled out, this time from the legal department. The subject line read, "Friendly reminder, professionalism during transition." The body of the message was a masterpiece of fear dressed as courtesy. Phrases like procedural alignment and minimizing unnecessary stress were scattered across the page, but the subtext was clear. Do not gossip. Do not speculate. And above all, do not ask questions. The same voices that had once told me I was too cautious were now choking on their own caution, begging employees to keep their mouths shut. It was ironic, really. I had never once shouted, never once made a scene. All I had done was ask for clarification. Now they were the ones panicking about noise. Friends kept sending me whispers. Someone said payroll analyst Craig Benson, 33, had nearly broken down after being told to retrieve overtime records from 2016. He muttered, "I was in high school then," before locking himself in the break room. Another reported that executives were calling 3 alignment meetings a day, each one more frantic than the last. Even the CEO, Richard Lang, 56, had canceled his golf trip, something he had never done before. He was seen pacing the hallway with a phone pressed to his ear, his face gray with worry. The mighty leaders were unraveling, and all I did was sip tea and water my ivy. That evening, I opened my window, let the cool night air in, and watched the neighborhood lights flicker on one by one. For the first time in years, I was not the one carrying the panic home. It was inside Northwell Dynamics now, spreading like smoke in the vents. I leaned back in my chair, smiled faintly, and whispered to Margaret, "Let them chase their own shadows. We have waited long enough." 2 days later, the sound arrived not in the form of a siren, not in a shout, but in a tidy little PDF stamped with the state seal. At 9:14 a.m., the Ohio Division of Wage and Hour Compliance sent its official request. 2 pages, polite but devastating, asking for payroll records, classification files, contractor agreements, and overtime logs covering 7 full years. It landed in the company's legal inbox, the same inbox that for years had ignored my flagged reports and my urgent subject lines. This time, there would be no ignoring. A friend inside told me the email was opened by an assistant named Emily, who ran down the hallway carrying her laptop like it was on fire. Within 20 minutes, executives were already in a closed-door huddle, their voices raised loud enough that even the interns in marketing could hear. By mid-morning, the panic had spread like spilled ink. Boxes of old records were dragged out of storage rooms, covered in dust and labeled with years in fading marker. Payroll analyst Craig, who had been muttering about high school dates just days before, was reportedly tasked with digging through stacks taller than he was. Carla sent me another message, this time just 5 words. "It is happening for real?" The office that once mocked me for being too detailed was now suffocating under the weight of every detail they had ignored. And I, sitting at my dining room table in sweatpants, watched it unfold from a safe, quiet distance. Slack channels, once buzzing with jokes and gifs, went completely silent. The marketing team, famous for their motivational Monday posts, did not dare share a single sunrise quote. Managers who normally signed off their emails with cheers suddenly ended messages with cold regards. Even the most talkative employees avoided eye contact in the hallways, as if speaking out loud might summon auditors faster. The silence itself was louder than any explosion. It was the kind of silence that comes when people realize there is nowhere left to hide. That afternoon, whispers reached me about CEO Richard Lang himself. He had been pacing back and forth in his office, a golf magazine still sitting unopened on his desk, the canceled trip a reminder that his priorities had shifted overnight. Some said he snapped at his assistant, demanding why nobody had seen this coming. Others said he sat in the dark for a long time, phone in hand, dialing and hanging up before finally calling outside counsel. Richard, who once bragged that audits were just paperwork theater, was now living in the center of a performance he could not control. I leaned back in my chair, Margaret the ivy soaking up sunlight on the windowsill, and thought about the irony. For years, I had been their invisible safeguard, the one who made sure the house of cards stood upright. Now that I was gone, the cards were falling, one after another, and it was not because I had pushed them. It was because I had simply stepped aside and let gravity do its work. The knock on the door was not mine. It belonged to the state, and Northwell Dynamics had no choice but to open it. The first call came on a Friday morning, just after I had finished folding laundry and was settling in with a second cup of coffee. My phone buzzed, an unknown number flashing across the screen. I let it ring out of curiosity. When it called back a second time, I still ignored it. By the third attempt, I answered, not out of politeness but to stop the buzzing. I said nothing, just let the silence hang there. Finally, a voice cracked through the line. "Linda, hi, it is Elaine from Human Resources. I hope you are doing well." Her cheerfulness was so forced it sounded like glass about to break. She cleared her throat, rushed ahead before I could respond. We just wanted to touch base and clarify some things about your recent email to the labor board. It seems there may have been some misunderstanding, and we are concerned it might be viewed as a formal complaint which could trigger unnecessary escalation. The words landed like a confession. My fingers tapped the rim of my coffee mug while I waited for her to keep digging. Finally, I answered, calm and measured. I did not file a complaint. I CC'd the board for clarification regarding the phrasing in your termination documents. Nothing more? The silence that followed was thick, the kind that drips with the weight of realization. Elaine tried again, her voice smaller now. Well, yes, of course, but the audit has created a great deal of stress internally, and some departments feel that, perhaps, if you were willing to retract the inquiry, we could revisit your severance. Maybe extend your health coverage? Perhaps even include outplacement support. She dangled the words like prizes, as if I could be bribed into erasing the truth. I almost laughed but held it in, savoring the irony. They had called my 18 years of service redundant, yet now here she was offering more just to make the problem disappear. I sipped my coffee, let the pause stretch, and answered simply, "That is generous, but I am not negotiating. I am not involved anymore. The matter is between you and the state." For the first time in all the years I had known Elaine, she had no response ready. I imagined her sitting in her pristine office, staring at her notes, lipstick trembling at the corners. Finally, she muttered a polite thank you and hung up. The call ended with nothing but a dial tone, leaving me alone with the quiet satisfaction of someone who had just reminded a giant that the ground beneath it was shifting. I set my phone down, leaned back, and looked at Margaret basking in the sun on the sill. They had underestimated me for almost 2 decades, treating me as invisible, dependable, and easily discarded. But invisibility has its advantages. You see everything. You remember everything. And when the time comes, you do not need to raise your voice to make them listen. All it takes is one calm sentence, one CC, and the sound of someone else's panic filling the silence. The following Thursday came crisp and bright, the kind of morning when the world outside feels calm and ordinary. But inside Northwell Dynamics, the air was heavy with dread. At exactly 9 o'clock, the auditors arrived. No fanfare, no drama, no storming through the doors in suits and sunglasses. Just 3 plain men and women in navy blazers carrying briefcases and clipboards, badges clipped neatly to their belts. They walked through reception with quiet authority, signed the visitor log, and were escorted straight to conference room B, the one with the broken projector that nobody ever bothered to fix. Within minutes, stacks of binders were wheeled in on a cart, the smell of old paper mixing with the tension already thick in the hallways. Word traveled fast. Carla texted me almost immediately, her message short and blunt. "They are here." A second later, she followed up with a grainy photo taken through the cracked door of the conference room. The auditors sat calmly at the long table, already unpacking files, while managers hovered nervously at the edges, their expressions grim. Elaine stood near the window, her smile forced, her posture rigid. Even Tyler, the intern, looked pale as he shuffled papers into stacks that were already collapsing. Nobody laughed. Nobody joked. The office that once mocked my obsession with detail was now being dissected by people who lived and breathed detail for a living. By mid-morning, the panic had spilled into every department. Payroll analysts were asked to retrieve records from 2016, files they had forgotten existed, some of which I had labeled and filed myself years earlier. Mark Jensen, the finance director, reportedly snapped at his assistant when she handed him a folder missing signatures. "Do you realize what this means?" he hissed, loud enough for others to hear. Meanwhile, Richard Lang, the CEO, canceled his entire schedule and shut himself away in his office with the blinds drawn. The man who once strutted through the halls boasting about efficiency was suddenly nowhere to be seen. Even the smallest signs gave the truth away. The cafeteria line was silent, no chatter, no laughter, only the scrape of trays. Slack channels went from daily GIFs and memes to nothing but clipped requests for documents and terse acknowledgments. People who had been fearless gossipers were suddenly mute. It was the sound of an organization realizing that its secrets were no longer safe. And all the while, the auditors worked quietly, their pens scratching across notepads, their voices calm and professional as they requested one file after another. At home, I sat by my window, Margaret stretching her vines toward the light, while I read the updates that trickled into my phone. I pictured the auditors turning the pages of the reports I had once compiled, seeing the careful notes I had left in margins, the warnings ignored, the issues buried. For years, they treated me like a ghost, invisible and unimportant. But now, my ghost was in the room with them, woven into every document, every correction, every file they wished they had shredded but never did. The audit had arrived, and there was no escaping it. By Friday morning, the collapse was no longer a whisper. It was visible in every corner of Northwell Dynamics. Carla's texts grew more frantic, little snapshots of an office unraveling thread by thread. Mark is yelling again. Payroll pulled into emergency huddle. Elaine has been in the bathroom for 20 minutes. These were not the signs of a confident leadership team. These were the signs of a company buckling under the weight of 7 years of negligence finally unearthed. The once bustling Slack channels were graveyards now. No emojis, no jokes, only curt instructions like locate 2017 contractor files immediately and send logs directly to auditors. The silence was deafening. One message made me pause. Carla wrote, Craig had a panic attack when asked for manager overtime approvals from 2015. They had to walk him out with water and tissues. I could almost see him, pale and shaking, trying to explain how records older than his entire tenure were suddenly his responsibility. Meanwhile, Richard Lang, the CEO, had not been seen in 2 days. His golf club sat in the corner of his office like abandoned trophies, and rumors swirled that he was locked in daily calls with outside counsel, his booming voice reduced to a hoarse whisper. This was the man who once called audits paperwork theater. Now the show was playing to a full house, and he had forgotten his lines. Elaine, once polished and confident, was unraveling in her own way. Carla described seeing her emerge from a closed-door meeting with mascara streaked across her cheeks, a yellow sticky note stuck to her heel, looking like someone who had lost control of her own story. She had spent years telling me to let the little things go, that not every discrepancy was worth chasing. Now every little thing was being chased by people with clipboards and authority, and she was drowning in the same sea she told me to ignore. Tyler, her young intern, reportedly whispered to a coworker, "Why did they ever let Linda go?" I almost laughed when Carla told me that. The answer was simple. They thought I was expendable because I was quiet. They thought wrong. By afternoon, even the social dynamics had shifted. Employees avoided the cafeteria, eating quietly at their desks or not at all. People who once gossiped in hallways kept their heads down, afraid that even casual chatter might land them in the auditor's notes. The culture of casual arrogance had evaporated, replaced by something colder, survival. It was strange to watch from a distance, to see the house of cards fall without lifting a finger. I had given them nearly 20 years of silent labor, of fixing what others broke, and now, for the first time, I was watching them face their own mistakes with no shield to protect them. That evening, I poured myself a glass of wine and stood by the window, the city lights flickering against the glass. Margaret's vines stretched further across the sill, green and alive. I whispered to her, "They wanted to call me redundant. But tell me, Margaret, does this look like a company that can survive without me?" The answer was already written in the silence of their collapsing empire. The call came just as the sun was setting on a Sunday evening. I had been folding fresh sheets, the smell of clean cotton rising into the air, when my phone buzzed with a number I recognized immediately. It was Ben Torres, 48, Chief Financial Officer of Northwell Dynamics. I let it ring twice before I answered, calm as ever. His voice was not the booming baritone I remembered from budget meetings. It was thinner now, almost shaking. "Linda," he said, "I need to ask you something." I stayed quiet, waiting. Finally, he whispered, "Why did I just get a notice that the Labor Board is opening a full payroll audit going back 7 years?" I folded the sheet in my hands, smoothed the edge, and said evenly, "I simply sent a clarification. I asked for verification on the wording in your termination documents. That is all." The silence that followed was long, heavy, suffocating. I could hear his breath catching like a man carrying too much weight. At last he spoke, his voice cracking. "Do you understand what this means? Retroactive overtime, contractor reclassifications, penalties, interest, 7 figures at least. Investors are furious. This could cripple operations." His words tumbled out like dominoes already falling. But I did not rush to catch them. I did not soften my voice or offer reassurance. I just said, "I am not involved anymore. This is between Northwell Dynamics and the state of Ohio. For years, I had been their invisible safety net, the one who patched the holes before anyone noticed the leaks. Now, without me, they were drowning in their own negligence. And here was the CFO, a man who once ignored my 30-page compliance memo with a wave of his hand, reduced to begging for answers over the phone. I almost felt pity, but then I remembered every ignored warning, every late-night email brushed off, every time they told me I was overcomplicating things. Pity was wasted on people who had been given years of warnings and chose arrogance instead. When I finally hung up, I did not slam the phone down or smile smugly. I simply placed it on the table, poured myself a glass of wine, and let the silence settle. Margaret, my ivy, stretched toward the window, her leaves glowing faintly in the fading light. I whispered, "We did not burn the house down. We just turned on the lights." Because that was the truth. I had not shouted, had not stormed, had not sought vengeance in the traditional sense. All I had done was ask for clarification, and in doing so, I had forced the truth into the open. That night, as the city outside hummed quietly, I thought about the irony. They had called me redundant, unnecessary, invisible. But it turned out I had been the pillar all along, the one holding up their fragile empire. Without me, their secrets were laid bare, their foundation crumbled, their power shook. My victory was not loud, but it was permanent. And sometimes, the quietest victories are the ones that echo the longest. They thought I was replaceable. They thought I would leave quietly. But when the truth surfaced, it was not anger that brought the company to its knees. It was a calm request for clarification and the power of a paper trail. Never underestimate the quiet ones, because silence does not mean weakness. Sometimes, silence means patience. And patience, when the moment arrives, can become the sharpest weapon of all. If this story struck a chord with you, share your thoughts below, and do not forget to subscribe to Revenge Vault for more stories where betrayal meets justice and the invisible finally gets seen.